It's a real honour to introduce Jillian. I was privileged enough to hear her speak the other morning, and I think for that reason and the fact she's been on a pretty gruelling speaking circuit, she's unfortunately not very well today. So we're actually going to conduct this session. Sarah's going to interview her, and then we might just have a bit more of an informal Q&A session. And Jillian will do her best. She might have to do a bit of charades or interpretive dance, but just bear with her. So Jillian's the Director of the International Freedom of Expression at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Although she specialises in freedom of expression issues in the Arab world, her work encompasses a broad range of topics from digital security to the privatisation of censorship. Her work's been featured in Al Jazeera, The Guardian, Foreign Policy, The Atlantic, and The New York Times, among others. She's also a regular speaker at global events. I'd like everyone to put your hands together and welcome Jillian.
I'll line up.
As was just said, Jillian's not very well at the moment, and the main issue being that everything's fine except for talking. So what we think is probably the best way of running this session is is sort of as an interview rather than to have Jillian stand up there and do 20 minutes without a break. I think that would be extremely difficult. We've worked out that the thing that makes Jillian's feel the best is actually beer. That's one of the best excuses I've ever seen. I'm going to remember that one. But listen, I think that, I'm happy to interview Jillian for a bit, but please, it will become clear what this session is about. And I'm going to be having a look out for arms in the air, because what I think we should do is really have a Q&A session, not just questions from me, but questions from the audience. Because the broad topic is really going to be the issue of internet spying, and which has become incredibly topical with the revelations of Edward Snowden in the last year. Perhaps we could start with the fact that the other day when we did the breakfast talk at Maurice Blackburn, you were talking about how that was not news to you, that your organisation has in fact run litigation about this before Edward Snowden had done his legs.
Yeah, so what was really news, sorry. Just bear with me.
Can someone go and get another beer? Sorry.
It's okay. So, as I said the other day, it wasn't news to my organization or to me that the NSA was capturing lots of data on American citizens and on people around the world, because in 2005, we had actually had a whistleblower come to us. He had been working with AT&T, one of our major telecoms, and had learned that AT&T had a splitter cable in one of their server closets in San Francisco, and that was essentially, if you've heard the term prism, this was the prism. The information was flowing in one direction and then splitting when it hit that splitter, so that the information would flow onward, the communications would flow onward to their intended destination. But a copy of that was actually being captured by the National Security Agency. And this was all around mobile phones. So this was mobile phone conversations, data, metadata. And that prompted our first lawsuit, which was Juul versus the NSA. This lawsuit is ongoing. The Obama administration has tried to knock it down on the grounds of state secrets privilege, but the Ninth Circuit Court in the US overruled that, and we continue to push forward with this lawsuit.
So you mentioned the word metadata, and one of the comforting things that we've been told in light of these revelations is, oh, don't worry, the NSA isn't spying on your content, it's only metadata. Can you explain what metadata is, how is it different to content, and why then is it a problem for metadata, if it is a problem for metadata to be scooped up like this?
Sure. So metadata is different from content in the sense that it's all of the data that comes around the content. So you've got your email, and an email has the words that you write inside of the body, the subject line, but then it also has a number of other pieces of data. This is the metadata: your IP address, the time that you sent the email, the person whom you sent it to, and so on and so forth. So historically, metadata with phone calls was much simpler. It was literally the time that you picked up the phone and the number that you dialed. But you couldn't capture or triangulate much else about a person based on that. And especially if we're talking about landline phones, you already knew where the call was originating. Now in a world where we have laptops, mobile phones, iPads, etc., what metadata can do is just simply much more. So to give an example of this, a colleague of mine came up with this example, and I think it's a really good one. Imagine that you call an HIV hotline, or sorry, you call your doctor, you get test results, then you call an HIV hotline, and then maybe you call a friend. Now you've got these 3 different phone calls on your mobile phone. They know where you made the calls from, the order in which you made the calls, the numbers that you made the calls to, and if there is someone that is trying to harm you with that data, that metadata, they can do so simply by connecting those dots together. And so while they may not know what is in the contents of your phone call, they know who you're calling. And so you can imagine a number of scenarios where just that metadata is enough to incriminate someone.
And so I think the impact on privacy is clear. Whether it's justified is a different issue, but it's clearly is an impact on privacy because it is private information if you've called an HIV hotline, even if they can't listen into what you're actually saying. Are there any other human rights that you think or that are impacted by this sort of activity?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, as you said, the impact on privacy is clear. But I think that the impact on freedom of expression and freedom of association is perhaps even more severe and perhaps less clear to the general public. And so I can think of this in a couple of different ways. On the one hand, I think that we've seen, and I'm just going to see if I can find these statistics, which I did not have open. So PEN, which is an international writers organization, a membership organization, their New York chapter surveyed their members, who are all writers and journalists, and asked them what the impact of surveillance was on their writing. What they found was that 28% of those surveyed had curtailed various activities online. 24% had deliberately avoided writing about certain topics. There were particular statements from journalists or writers whose work covers sensitive places in the Middle East. And 16% admitted to self-censoring. And this was, whether in their emails or whether writing publicly, the fact is that people felt as though, for whatever reason, they did have something to hide. And that doesn't mean that what you're doing is illegal. Feeling that you have something to hide is, it's a matter of privacy, but I think it's also a matter of free expression. Now, on to the effects on freedom of association. Excuse me. We have another lawsuit that we filed last year. This one is called First Unitarian versus the NSA, and it is comprised of 19 different organizations, from church groups to gun membership organizations to digital rights groups like my own. And the one thing that all of these groups have in common is that they keep logs on their membership. They're, in various ways, they're all membership organizations. And the way that they were looking at this is that not only is the privacy of their members important, but the freedom of association. So by having those membership rolls surveilled, we already have the right to not turn over your membership rolls to the government. That was established in NAACP versus Alabama in 1959. But now, with the mass surveillance that's being conducted, the privacy and association of those individuals is once again under threat. And so I think that that's another example. And I guess the last example I would give, talking feels better, the last example that I would give of that is a lot of times people say I've got nothing to hide, but that doesn't take into account the effects that what you do online could have on the other people that you're connected with. So if I'm willing to take great risks for whatever cause is important to me, that might be my prerogative, and I'm doing so with consent. I'm doing so from an informed perspective. But what about all those people that are my Facebook friends? Some of them are, mothers, friends, just living their everyday lives, and they become connected to me through all of this metadata. And that might put them at risk if I'm putting myself at risk.
Okay, I've got more questions, but I'll remind the audience that if anyone's got a question at any time, just put up your hand and I can throw to you. Enjoying the Tony Jones thing? You don't understand that, that's okay.
I'm working on my Australianisms.
Okay, well surely some surveillance is necessary. Would you accept that? And if not, why not? And if so, when?
Yeah, I mean, this one's hard for me to admit because I would love to live in a world where no surveillance at all is necessary. But I think that when we talk about surveillance that is necessary, for me, what we're talking about is targeted surveillance, not mass surveillance. And that's an important distinction to make. So the difference is that targeted surveillance, at least in the US and in a lot of countries, is done with due process. You have the courts involved, law enforcement follows proper procedures, and an individual is under suspicion for other reasons, not just because they happen to be the wrong color or the wrong whatever. Mass surveillance, however, presumes that everyone is guilty and sweeps up data about all of us, whether we have done anything wrong or not. And so we've actually put out a set of, with a number of other organizations, I have to give them credit because there are a lot of people that worked on this. Last year, in fact, shortly before the Snowden revelations, we put out a set of 13 principles for the application of human rights to surveillance, to communication surveillance, and those are at necessaryandproportionate.org. From the title, you can tell that two of the most important elements of those 13 principles are that surveillance be both necessary and proportionate. And we feel that mass surveillance never is. And so if you look at those, you'll see other things. One, for example, another piece of the principles involves the integrity of communication systems. So, you can talk about surveillance being both necessary and proportionate, and people following proper procedures, but if you also at the same time fail to protect our communication systems and allow them essentially to be backdoored, if people don't know what that means, allowing law enforcement or other government agencies to have kind of a backdoor entry to whatever database, then the rest of it doesn't matter. The rule of law ceases to matter.
I think we've got a question just there. We may, while we're waiting for the microphone, I might just throw, I actually didn't realise Elaine. Elaine is the other speaker on the panel, so I won't actually introduce her, but I'll let her ask a question.
I have a question. I guess we hear quite a bit about the impact that surveillance has, particularly on journalists, the sort of chilling...
Microphone. Is that microphone? We have this microphone on.
Shall I just speak into this one? We hear a lot about the chilling effect that it has on free speech, but I guess, have you documented the impact that it has had, particularly for US journalists? And can you talk maybe a bit about, the impact it has?
So in fact, there's been a lot of work done around surveillance of journalists, and we know in the US that a number of our journalists have been under surveillance for various reasons. And yet, I think that the thing about journalists is that journalists tend to be brave and willing to take risks. They're some of the most brave people that we have in our societies. And so actually, I'm going to flip that a little bit and say that I think that the main impact that surveillance has on journalism is on sources, not on journalists themselves. Certainly there are scenarios in which journalists are also put at risk. I think that the risks that have been apparent to Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras since they received the documents from Edward Snowden are clear, although they were able to re-enter the US, which we're all grateful for. But I think that the risks present to sources are what we need to start talking about more. Journalists, like I said, they're willing to take risks. They're often willing to say, okay, well, I'm a journalist, I have nothing to hide, therefore I'm not going to use privacy-enhancing technologies, I'm not going to secure my communications. And that's fine if you're making that as an informed choice, but that also means that sources may be less willing to come forward. And I'll remind you that Edward Snowden first tried to approach Glenn Greenwald, and Glenn Greenwald did not know how to use PGP, this email security tool, and so he went to Laura Poitras instead, and she did know how to use it because she had had experience with that in the past. Fortunately, she brought him back around and they ended up partnering on this. But I think that that's a really clear example of what happens when people are unaware of the effects of surveillance.
Okay, we've now got this question.
Yeah, it's working. So I just had a question that was kind of related to the metadata that you were talking about. In the example that you gave, can it be more dangerous for them to have the metadata because, say, in the example that the person calls a HIV hotline and then calls their friend, can the assumption be made that either they have HIV or their friend has HIV? They can jump to the wrong conclusion. So what can the metadata be used for legally? Can they do anything with it?
That's a really good question that I am afraid that I don't have the proper answer to. I should have started this by saying I'm one of the not lawyers in the room. And so because my work has kind of encompassed surveillance around the world, I'm not always up to speed on the specific laws and regulations in the US. So I apologize for that. I think, though, at the same time that it's important to think about it in terms of what they theoretically could do. So while I'm unclear on what the legal provisions are in that area, the fact that they have the metadata, and another point that I would make here is that while I have promoted and just talked about encrypted communications and how important they are, one of the things that we know that the NSA does is holds on to those longer than unencrypted communications. And that's so that eventually when they're able to crack them, then they could. For me, that's an argument that everybody should use encryption, not that nobody should. But nonetheless, I think that the fact that they're doing that indicates that the rule of law may not matter to them so much in the end at all.
Okay, we've got another question just in the front here.
Hi. I was thinking about the reaction in Australia to Snowden's revelations, and of course the similar operations are being conducted by our intelligence agencies and so on, but I found the reaction quite muted. I wonder if you could just, I don't know if you've had enough experience here yet, but talk about the difference between the US and Australia in terms of the attitude to privacy. You might have heard from an earlier presentation, we don't actually have a legal right to privacy in most states in Australia and federally. I've always admired how the EFF is able to launch large-scale litigation when it comes to protecting people's privacy, and I just feel that that attitudes and legal difficulties in Australia are really sort of preventing that. I don't know if you've got a sense of...
I unfortunately don't really yet, and I was not here this morning because I was seeing the doctor, but what I have heard from people all week, and I apologize because I really, really am unqualified to speak on behalf of Australians, but what I've heard from people all week is just that the conversation here is not happening at the same level as it is in the US. Now, at the same time, I sometimes feel that in the US, while everyone is ready to step up for free expression, that is, obviously it's our First Amendment, the right to free expression, and most people in the US would never accept any restrictions on that. I'm always surprised at how many people are willing to manipulate the Fourth Amendment in the US to say, well, but metadata doesn't fall under that. This is the right to, this prevents search and seizure, not capture of metadata. And so there is a lot of that sort of arguing happening, and I wonder then, and I can't answer that, but I wonder then if the sense of privacy here is perhaps stronger, and that perhaps those two concepts are almost reversed. But I honestly, I'm not sure at this point.
One response which I heard when Snowden was making his revelations, one response which was sort of encouraging people to relax, it's not a big deal, was the fact that, okay, this is showing that the government, the US government, is, and probably other governments, is scooping up enormous amounts of information about all of us. But we should know that Google does that too, and Facebook does it. And should we be more or less worried that these private companies, which perhaps are less accountable, they've got enormous amounts of our information which we've given them?
They do, and I do think that we should be concerned about that, but I think that there's a couple of major differences. One is that when you sign up to use the services of a private company, you are consenting to their terms of service. Now, I realize that there are ways in which companies have recently violated their own terms of service, it seems. Maybe you heard about Facebook conducting emotional manipulation on its users. Have people heard about this? No? Raise your hand if no. Okay, I'll give you the quick rundown. Basically, Facebook, in conjunction with a couple of universities, no, U.S. universities, they basically manipulated users' emotions by ramping up the number of happy posts that you would receive on your feed for some people, and for other people, the number of sad posts. And presumably they did this algorithmically through identifying keywords that represented happy or sad in some way or another. And then the idea was to see how people reacted, how people were posting at the end of that week. There are a lot of questions around whether users really consented to this or not. It seems as though Facebook actually conducted the research before they had posted that they had the approval to do so. Lots of questions there. And also last night someone had mentioned to me that they're not sure about the consent on Facebook tracking you on other websites. So there are a lot of questions there, and I don't mean to be dismissive of them, but I think that there are two things. So one is that we've consented to use these sites. Two is that Facebook, Google, they don't have militaries. Yet. And so, I think that if you look at some of the revelations from Edward Snowden around the ways in which surveillance is being used to target and murder people in other parts of the world, like Yemen, then I think that you can extend that and see what the potential consequences are when a government gone rogue has all of your data. I don't see Facebook having that kind of capability anytime soon. And while I also caution against using this argument, the fact is that you can leave Facebook. I'm not saying that that's an easy thing to do, and I realize, but really, I don't think it is an easy thing to do. And I don't like it when people say, oh, if you don't like it, just leave. No, it's a method of engagement for sure in a number of different ways. But I can leave Facebook. I don't have any other citizenship. I don't have an option to leave the United States. And even if I did leave the United States, it seems that my government has decided it can kill American citizens anywhere in the world now. So,
Well, yeah, join that club. But anyway, sorry.
I know that was.
Sorry. No, but Lizzie.
I just wanted to ask, in terms of the movement for individuals as a collective, whatever, to regain control over their data, to what extent do you think that movement is going to be primarily technical in terms of finding technical solutions to mass surveillance, instead of, say, politically, where I think a lot of activists feel that there's not enough public awareness and concern about the level of mass surveillance and the need to reverse or turn the tables on it?
That's a really great question, and I talk to people a lot about this question. There are some people who feel that the only solutions are technical ones. There are other people who feel that political solutions have to be paramount. I think that from the technical folks, a lot of them are looking at this from a systems perspective and saying, okay, now that this system is in place, even if we can get these protections on it, how do we actually roll that back? And I've even heard people making economic arguments around that. If we roll that back, how many people lose jobs? Of course, that argument in the US also applies to our prison system, unfortunately. How many people lose jobs if we stop imprisoning 25% of black men? Well, I don't really care, is my answer. But nevertheless, to answer the question properly, I actually believe that this has to be dealt with on all levels. I don't think that there is one solution or the other that's better. And so for me, those different levels are litigation, absolutely. I think at least in our political context in the US, at the moment, I personally believe that litigation has more impact than politics, than legislative solutions. But then I do think that those are important as well. I think that we have to work with our elected officials, and we have to oust them if they're not fighting for the things that we believe in. 3, technology. I absolutely think that there's an incredible movement right now to try to create more usable, user-friendly technologies that help people protect themselves against surveillance. Because at the moment, I will admit, it's not easy. I use most of these tools to varying levels of consistency, but very few of them are what I would call easy. Most of them are advanced level, and that's not right. We have to make these accessible to everyone. And then I think the last thing is we have to start having this conversation on a societal level. What kind of world do we want to live in? Like I said before at the very beginning, I would love to live in a world where no surveillance was required at all. But I'm compromising on my own values when I say, okay, well, targeted surveillance in certain circumstances. Now, I mean, I realize that saying no surveillance at all is not a very realistic perspective. But nevertheless, I think that societally we have to start thinking about what is the role of government? What is the role when we have an internet that is completely global and yet fragmented on lines of censorship, on lines of privacy, on all of these various lines?
I'm interested in the role of journalists in this. I mean, I suppose turning specifically to the Edward Snowden issue, releasing the documents to Laura Poitras and Glenn Greenwald. You probably know, I think I sent you a link to the idea that it's being proposed in this country that to report such things in the future in this country will be, could be illegal, which means people like Glenn Greenwald, etc., won't be visiting Australia anytime soon. What do you think is the ideal role of a journalist when they get this information? Because we've seen sort of two different models. We see Glenn Greenwald, who's drip feeding it to us, and claims that the information is completely secure, that he's got it and no one else has it. I don't know if that's true, but that's what he claims. And then you have the Julian Assange model, at least with the Iraq war logs, released them, the Afghan logs, released them, then did the drip feed a little bit with the State Department, and then fell out with his, and then the relationships with the newspapers fell away, and ultimately did release all the information. I mean, how should a journalist treat this sort of information, and what's their role?
Yeah, no, this is a hard question because I think that it really depends on the purpose of the leaked data. And so when it comes to WikiLeaks, there were instances, such as with the Afghan war logs, where I felt that what they did was completely justified. Now, my understanding from an outsider's perspective was that with Cablegate, that the intent was, in fact, to moderate the release of those, and that, as you mentioned, the falling out between Julian Assange and Daniel Domscheit-Berg made that process very different. And I don't buy the argument that there was any great harm done by that release, but at the same time, there were minor harms done, and I think it's unfair for us not to admit that there are people who are named in those cables whose lives have been impacted. They are alive. They are, but I know a couple of people who don't feel safe going back to their countries because they were named in those cables, and so it's not fair to ignore that. At the same time, I think that with these documents, I've been frustrated at the speed at which they've been coming out, and I've been frustrated by certain elements, certain things that, I don't know what's in there, I haven't seen them, but there are things that I suspect are in there, such as some of the data sharing agreements between the US and countries that are outside of Five Eyes and NATO, but that content's not available, and it's frustrating to sit there and wait for it. And so I think that journalists do need to play an intermediary role. I think it's a very important place for them to be. I want this information to be free when it is doing us harm, but I think that there's questions around both the utility of a bulk release and around the necessity of a bulk release. I realize there are a lot of people who disagree on both ends. There are people who'd rather this stuff never come out, and there are people who'd rather it all come out at once. But I do think that journalists can play a really strong editorial role in helping contextualize what this stuff means for us.
Okay, we've got a question again right at the back. We've got a mic very close. I think they're all descending on you.
Considering a bunch of the audience are lawyers or law students, I'm wondering about what you might know about lawyer-client communications and the surveillance of that by authorities, and also what lawyers might be able to do to protect their clients. I saw a little video. I think it was Snowden himself, or it was the journalists that got the information from him. And one of the things that was said in that little video on, I think it was The Guardian, was that lawyers need to start protecting their clients by making sure that their own communications are as secure as possible. And I wonder if you knew more about that sort of thing.
So again, I can't speak to the legal aspect of that, although lawyer-client communications in the United States are privileged, and so even if they were captured, I believe it would be dismissed by a court. Nevertheless, we can answer the second question a lot better, which is to say that, look, I mean, just like with a journalist and a source, a lawyer and a client, there's a power differential there. And that's not to say that the journalist or the lawyer is going to do harm. No, in fact, both of them have a solid public interest in what they do. But at the same time, it is often the source or the client that is the more vulnerable person in that equation. Therefore, it is the journalist or the lawyer who must take responsibility and utilize these tools. Now, as I said before, though, these tools are still not there in terms of usability. And I mean, my mother works at a nonprofit where she runs the systems, and a lot of it is healthcare related content. And I hear stories from her every week about how doctors have terrible use of passwords. And we're talking about healthcare records. That's terrifying to think about what could be captured and how that could affect, you guys have real healthcare, but in my country, how that could affect your ability to be insured and things like that. And so I think that, yeah, those people who are in positions of relative privilege, I think that it is up to that level of society to start taking responsibility for encrypting their communications. How? Well, I can't give a lesson right now on exactly what you can do. I can say that we're releasing a project in a few weeks that aims to answer that question. And I think that I'll just give you my quick spiel on that, which is to say that a lot of times people make it about the tools, and it's actually not so much about the tools, although those are important. It's about understanding your particular risk and doing a risk assessment of what that means. And so I encourage people to ask themselves questions like, what am I trying to protect? Is it healthcare records, lawyer-client communications, whatever? How important is it that I protect it? What are the consequences if I don't protect it? How much effort am I willing to put in to protect these communications? And I know there's a fifth question there, and I'm blanking on it. I think it's my cold brain. I guess I'm not going to remember the fifth question, but I promise this will be up on our website soon. It's going to be at ssd.eff.org. And so we're going to walk people through that, but then we're also going to then show them, okay, well, here are some tools that you can use. Here are some ways that you can protect yourself. And there's a number of different tools out there. A couple days ago, I mentioned one of the easiest ones, most usable ones right now is an SMS replacement called Text Secure. Unfortunately, the thing about end-to-end encryption, which is to say that when you hold your own keys, as opposed to the company holding those for you, is that it requires both people on the ends of the communication line to be using the tool. And so that's one of the hardest things is even if the doctor or the journalist or the lawyer is willing to use it, they then have to convince their clients to use it as well. And so I'm not saying that there are easy answers, but I do think that over the past 2 years, even before this known revelations, we've seen such an outpouring of funding and development of these types of tools. So I'm fingers crossed that things will continue to go in that direction.
What do you say to the governments, and our government is already ramping up the argument about we need to do all this surveillance, we need to keep all this data to fight terrorism. What's your response?
Prove it. That's my response. No, seriously, I have not seen a strong argument from my government that mass surveillance solves any of these problems. I mean, we needn't be dismissive of terrorism to agree that this has gone too far. I think that, if you look at, for example, the Boston Marathon bombings last year, 2 years ago, that's a great example of this. You had two, or at least one, if not two of the people involved in that under FBI surveillance already to a certain degree. You had cameras everywhere. You had all of these programs running, assuming these people were somehow in contact over their phones or email, and yet, what did it do to stop it? Nothing. And that's been true of a number of different acts since 9/11. And so I think that when governments make that argument, I think that the onus is on them to demonstrate why it's necessary, why targeted surveillance is insufficient for that.
I'll give you one more question and then we'll let you let you recover. The final is there a solution? Do you think it's possible to roll back this level of spying?
I'm really trying hard to be optimistic. Like I said earlier, I think that from a systems perspective, this can look very, very dreary. But from a socio-political perspective, I'm heartened by the efforts that I've seen in the past year to fight back against this, both in terms of litigation. I mean, we're now not the only people suing the NSA. There are now lots of lawsuits against the NSA. There are senators and Congress people who are fighting back against this in our legislature. There are all of these funders coming forward and saying, okay, let's fund these tools to be developed. Let's also fund people like us to create education on how to use these tools and how to protect yourself. And so I think that, it's not there yet. We're not where at the level that we need to be to actually roll this back. But the fight is ongoing, and I do see some real strength building out of this. If you look at movements historically, these take a long time. The fact that about a year ago most people didn't know about this means that look at how much we've already accomplished in a year. Think about the safe sex movement. Think about, just any movement. That's a really good one because you can draw lots of nice little analogies between encryption and safer sex. I gave a talk on that a couple months ago. But nevertheless, look at all of these historic movements and how long they took to not solve necessarily, but to mitigate against the problem. We haven't eradicated HIV. You have this conference happening right now. But look at the ways in which we've educated the public about the importance of protecting themselves against it. And then think about that and apply that to surveillance. It's going to take a while. This is a long fight, but we can do it.
Okay, well, I think I'll bring it to an end. So will you please join me in thanking Jillian, who's... that was a great effort, a great presentation, and thank you so much for that. And I won't talk to you anymore now. Okay.
And I'm happy to try to chat after, but don't try to shake my hand. You do not want this.